Hi, my name is Tom Stones, and yeah, thank you very much for coming by to watch my presentation today. Currently, I work at Kansai Gakuin University, as you can see on the screen, and you can also see my email there. So if you do have any questions about this presentation or are interested in researching similar topics, then do shoot me over an email. So today we're going to be talking about developing a rating scale for interactional competence. So we'll talk a little bit about interactional competence and also how to develop the rating scale for it. So today's goals. First of all, we'll talk about what is interactional competence and why is it important. Then we'll look at how we might go about assessing that. Next, we'll take a look at a rubric that we were using on a discussion skills course, seminar skills, discussion course at the university that I work at. So we'll analyze that rubric to see how effectively it is functioning using Many Facet Rasch Measurement. I'm not going to get very deep into the Rasch statistics, which can get extremely technical. So even if you don't know anything about Rasch measurement, you'll still be able to understand what I am talking about. So it's going to be very accessible, the information that I present. And finally, we'll talk about some recommendations for effective and reliable rubric design. I'm sure you're excited as I am, so we will get straight into it. So first of all, what is interactional competence? So term was coined in 1986 by Claire Cranch, and it is the ability to effectively co-construct an interaction with an interlocutor within a specific context. So basically means working together with a partner to achieve potentially some sort of shared goal, the shared interactional goals of whatever context you happen to be in. So whether that is reaching a consensus in a business meeting, or having a conversation with your friends, transacting with somebody in a shop, for example. Any of those type of situations involve both people working together to achieve the interaction, the goals of the interaction, unstated goals of the interaction, of course. And of course, it's central to interaction in a wide variety of real-world contexts. Increasingly used in language assessments at universities, so the assessment of interactional competence through paired speaking tests or group speaking tests, and also in some of the standardized exams. So the Cambridge exams at the higher levels have interactional competence components built into them. Of course, also, the interaction is one of the 5 spoken production categories in the Cepher scale. And of course, the reason for all of this is that, one, the predominance of, co-constructed interactions or interactions with other people in the real world, and therefore, there is a need to be able to assess that more accurately, which you can only really do if you're doing a paired or group speaking test. And you can't really see those skills in something like the IELTS test or a TOEFL test, which are monologic unidirectional speaking tests for the most part. Even if they do have a sort of interview component, they don't really interact with the examiner. So what makes up interactional competence? So can be many, many things, can have many subcomponents, but very generally could be things like interactive listening, topic development through asking questions or adding your own information to that already added by your partner. Things like managing the topic shift, dealing with communication breakdowns, inviting people to contribute, and responding appropriately when with people have asked you to contribute, and responding with sufficient detail, or whatever detail is sufficient for the particular context that you're interacting within. So here's an example of a scale. This is from McDonald's 2018. Perhaps my camera is covering the citation, but anyways, McDonald's 2018, and it's an example of an analytic rating scale used for assessing speaking. And we can see at the top, there's 5 categories: fluency, accuracy, complexity, interaction, and communicative effectiveness. So the interaction category would be the one that targets interactional competence. So this is known as an analytic rating scale, this type of scale, where there are several categories and then several scores, in this case 5 points available, with descriptors to describe each point on the scale. An alternative approach for assessing interactional competence could be a checklist type approach, whereby the examiner checks off skills as they have been used, and usually this would be a summative type of test where particular skills have been taught and then their use is assessed in the speaking test. So moving on to think about rubrics themselves. So how do we know if a rubric is actually working? How do we know if it is functioning correctly? And there can be a variety of reasons why it might not be. So for example, it could have differing rater interpretations. So different raters may interpret the descriptors differently, and they may vary in how strictly or leniently they apply that rubric, the framework. The rubric itself may have some inherent problems and may not be optimally calibrated. So maybe it might have too many scale points for the test of the abilities that you're assessing. Maybe the descriptors are confusing. Maybe they're conflated. Some of the constructs might be vaguely defined or mixed up together. So these can all lead to problems of application and therefore lead to inconsistent, unreliable scoring. So if we do have such a scenario, then Many Facet Rasch Measurement is something that can help us to identify these types of problems. What doesn't help us to solve them, but it can help us to identify where the problems lie. So basically, it compares the scores awarded to an idealized model, a statistical model, and shows how well the rubric might be functioning. And it allows for the comparison of a variety of factors, such as demographic characteristics of the test takers and the examiners, so the age, gender, for example, if you want, the difficulty of the tasks, so whether or not if learners take a number of tasks, do a number of tasks, then how difficult each one is relative to each other. Of course, compares learner performance to see who is the best performing and worst performing student. Also the functioning of the rubric to see if how reliable or how accurately the rubric actually scores along the latent variable or the target construct. So, speaking skills, for example. And also compares how severely the raters are scoring as well as many other things. So onto our particular study here. So basically, the aim of this research was to investigate the functioning of an intact existing rubric that we were using in a seminar discussion skills course at a Japanese university with intermediate learners. Speaking tests were formative or summative tests, which assessed skills that were learned already in the course. Basically, a 5-minute test. The students knew the topic in advance and had been practicing it and did the speaking test in pairs. Then for this research, I had 3 video samples of paired tests, so 6 students in total, and these were rated by 11 teachers. I then went on and analyzed those rubrics using Many Facet Rasch Measurement, the statistical method that I mentioned earlier. So here is the rubric that we had. So it had 3 parts, 3 sections, and it's kind of a checklist type of rubric that I've mentioned before. So there's discussion questions, top left, discussion skills, bottom left, and delivery and effectiveness on the right. So you can see within the discussion skills, discussion questions section, there were a number of questions which they were to try to deliver during the test. to help scaffold the interaction. For one of the tests, for example, they're talking about benefits and problems. Then discussion skills, there was a few skills that were included, some specific language, and they had to use some of those. So passing score at our university is 60%. But you can perhaps see some issues with these scoring systems. So, for example, there's very little information as to what constitutes a 6 or a 10. There's no detail other than pass and excellent, and the fact that they need to use 2 questions. There's also no details about how accurately they use those questions or how appropriately those questions are used in terms of grammatical accuracy or in terms of pronunciation, but also more importantly, how well it's used within the actual discussion itself. So they may just try and fire off questions, but their use may actually be quite unusual within the context of the ongoing talk. Also, 5 minutes is quite a short amount of time to try and use all of these skills. Now, on the right-hand side, also, another potential problem is that there's a number of constructs conflated under the umbrella term of delivery and effectiveness, with not really very clear delineation as to what each of those mean. There's also quite a lot of scale points on the charts as well. So 20 points is quite a lot, and we'll see that has caused some problems, which we'll see a little bit later. So let's take a look at the initial analysis. So this is one of the outputs that we get from Facets, which is the Rasch measurement program, and it gives us a range of information. On the very left-hand side gives us the ability measure. So this shows us on a logit scale. It's a logarithmic scale. So the original raw scores are converted into a logit scale, which actually is interval data. So it means that there is a consistent space between each point on the scale. And it will do this for any amount of any raw information that you input. So it means that it's a standardized measure of difficulty and ability. So makes it more reliable and easy to compare. So that's the very left-hand category. This actually is quite a narrow range for a test. Because we had a summative test, that sometimes happens where the demonstration of taught skills is a bit easier than something like an IELTS test where you're assessing general proficiency. You get a much wider range of abilities from maybe +4 to -4 logits maybe. But in this case, it's quite narrow. I'll very quickly go through each of the columns and briefly talk about what they mean. So the second column is students. So student WO, this is our best performing, highest ability student, and student RM is our lowest ability student. And as I said, this is quite a narrow range of abilities, which often happens with summative tests, but also happens when you have a lot of scale points, but a narrow range of abilities. So for some of these skills, we have 20 points, but maybe there's not 20 different levels of ability demonstrated in our test. So this part shows us the rater leniency, and we can see that rater A is the most lenient rater, and rater K is the strictest rater. This actually is quite good in terms of the raters. So they're all clustered close together, which basically means they're quite consistent in how they're applying the scores in some respects. If the raters are all spread out, it means that some raters are much more severe than others, which of course we want to avoid. But this is quite good. But as I said, it might be a factor of the narrow range of abilities relative to the number of points on the scale. Next section, this shows us how difficult each category is. So discussion questions is the easiest to get a good score on, and delivery and effectiveness discussion skills are relatively harder to get better skills on, scores on. Again, this is not too bad. Ideally, you want them near 0, a bit closer together, but on the whole, it's not too bad, but it could be better. Bigger problems we can see on this this side, on the other side. So this shows us the level at which each of the scale points transitions to the next one. So We can see here for discussion skills, that's the boundary for a score of 7. And ideally, we want these all in a line. So that should be equivalent to the score of 14 for the other scales, but it's not really. So we can see at the bottom, a score of 14 is much harder to achieve on the other categories than the score of 7 on discussion skills. Likewise, these two scores of 17, we'd actually want them to be in a line together, sort of lined up together. But they're not. So it means that the category 3 is harder to get a 17 than it is on category 2. So some problems there. Next, we can look at the individual categories and see how well they are working. So this is the category response curves, which we can get from Rasch. Very simply, this graph shows us whether or not there's an even progression up the scale points as the ability of the students increases. So, for example, the x-axis may be discussion skills ability. So 1 would represent the lower ability, 2 higher ability, 3 better ability. And this on the screen is an idealized version. So this is what you want from your rating scale. So each line represents one of the scale points. So this is an example of a 5-point scale. And what you want is each descriptor, each scale point to be separated from the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And so each of them have a relatively even amount of space allotted to them. So that means basically that the scale points reflect different levels of ability, and that there's a clear progression as you move up the scale. This is what we really want. You don't want them all bunched up and, well, you don't want them to look like this, is what we should say. So we can see that on all 3 of the rubrics, it's just a complete mess. As I said, each of these lines represents a different scale point on the rubrics. And it's just a total mess. There's no clear delineation between each category point, between each scale point. Everything's kind of over the top of each other. Some are subsumed by each others. None of the peaks are distinct and separate. So this is what we want, and this is what we've got. So this is just an absolute mess. So the problem that this actually is causing, or which this actually demonstrates, is it means that the raters are not clear about what each score means. So they don't know the difference between a 12 or a 13 or a 14, and they're not applying that consistently across raters. So it means that scoring is inconsistent, and it means that the students will get unreliable scores just depending on the coincidence of who their teacher is. But this is a real problem. So what do we do about it? So the solution to that would be to collapse together some of these scale points and reduce the number of scale points. Then what I did, and one thing you can do in Facets, the Rasch measurement program, is to recode the data, and that's what I did. So I combined together some of the scores. So for example, 1 to 11 was 0, 1 was 12, 2 was 13 to 14, etc., as you can see on the table in the middle. And that led to an output like you can see on the left. And this is much, much better than what we originally had, and much, much closer to what we want with the idealized category analysis. So it's not perfect, but if you're using a real world rubric in live situation, and you've got something like this, you wouldn't be too unhappy with how it's working. It could be better, but generally that's actually quite good, unlike what we did have happening. So what we did also was quite a heavy revision of the rubric itself. Here is what we came up with subsequent to the analysis, and you can see it's very, very different from the original rubrics that we had. So what we did was to make the categories clearer. So we have 4 categories across the top. So course language, overall interaction, fluency, and general language use. We had fewer better defined scale points, so a score of 1 to 5 with some interim categories as well. We had less focus on quantification and use of just using as many questions as possible, but instead focus more on the interactional aspects of the question use. So working towards the bigger picture of interacting well, rather than just simply using as many questions as you can in 5 minutes. So that's what we came up with. Of course, there's not time to go through every single one of these items, but do take a look if you're interested. Still a work in progress, and our next stage is to run some more tests and have some people rate some more speaking tests using this rubric, and then see what we get from that, do another Rasch analysis, get some more feedback, and see what people say. So let's move on to some quick recommendations for effective rubric design. First thing, generally better to have fewer scale points than more. So try and keep it light in that regard. Also, it's okay to have a lopsided scale. So for example, you could have 2 failing scores, but multiple pass scores if that's the profile that you have or tend to have with your learners. Have a clear distinction between points on the scale. Make sure there's a clear difference between a 1, 2, 3, or 4, and a 5. Make sure you clearly define the categories and constructs. Don't conflate them together and separate them out to the extent that that's possible. Often language, they do cluster together, but do as best as possible, try and separate them out and make that reflect what you've been teaching the learners on the course. So it should reflect what they've been focusing on. Yeah, it's good to have 1 scale point per construct, so 1 for pronunciation, 1 for fluency, etc. Up to a maximum of 7, which is said to be the max. Of course, make the scale fit the purpose of the course and the course goals. So as I said, make sure it reflects what you have taught to them and also what you want them to achieve or be able to achieve by the end of the course. Do gather feedback from users. This project was really interesting in terms of the information that teachers gave to me, and was much more focused than what we got from the usual wrap-up meetings. Most people were generally happy with the older rubric, but when we actually did the test and collected direct feedback, it was actually didn't really indicate as that. Yeah, it was super useful for us to get that information. And yeah, do gather data and analyze it. Even if you don't know how to use Rasch measurement, even just doing some descriptive statistics, looking to see how often people used each category, for example, doing averages and standard deviations can still yield pretty interesting information. So that's it for my presentation. Got to wrap up. Time is gone. So thank you very much for staying this far. Here's some references if you'd like them. And as I said, my email is at the front. So if you're interested in any of this or would like to ask about any of it, then shoot me over an email. Thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed the talk.